Adobe Acrobat Studio, so brand new. Show me all the things PDFs can do. Do your work with ease and speed. PDF Spaces is all you need. Do hours of research in an instant with key insights from an AI assistant. Pick a template with a click. Now your prezzo looks super slick. Close that deal? Yeah, you won. Do that, doing that, did that, done. Now you can do that with Acrobat. Now you can do that with the all-new Acrobat. It's time to do your best work with the all-new Adobe Acrobat Studio.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
This episode of Ben Franklin's World is brought to you by Cornell University Press. In Brethren by Nature, New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery, Margaret Ellen Newell reveals a little-known aspect of American history. English colonists in New England enslaved thousands of Indians. In fact, Massachusetts became the first English colony to legalize slavery in 1641. And the New Englanders' desire for Indian slaves was great. It actually shaped the region's major Indian wars, including the Pequot War, King Philip's War, and the Northeastern Wabanaki conflicts that took place between 1676 and 1749. And when not at war with native peoples, New Englanders looked to other sources to get their hands on Indian slaves. They turned to courts to get control of Indian labor, they imported Indians from Florida and the Carolinas, and they simply claimed free Indians as slaves. In her award-winning book, Newell recovers the slaves' own stories and shows how they influenced New England society in crucial ways. Indians lived in English homes, they raised English children, and they manned colonial armies, farms, and fleets. They also introduced their captors to native food, religion, and technology. Reviewers have called Newell's Brethren by Nature the best new research of Native America, slavery, and colonial New England, and an outstanding work that shakes the city upon a hill to its very core. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell for more information about Brethren by Nature. And if you like what you read, you can purchase a copy directly from Cornell University Press for a special discounted price of $17.47.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 117 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Thomas Jefferson. We know him as the drafter of the Declaration of Independence, the Sage of Monticello, and the United States' third president. He's a founding father who wrote a lot about liberty and freedom, and yet over the course of his lifetime, he owned over 600 slaves. Jefferson is a founder that many of us today have a hard time understanding, which is why we need to call in an expert, someone to lead us through his life so that we can better understand who the man was and how he came to his seemingly paradoxical ideas about slavery and freedom. So for this, our first episode dedicated to Thomas Jefferson, I've called in a preeminent scholar of Jefferson, Annette Gordon-Reed, a professor of history and legal history at Harvard University, and winner of both the National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize for her work on Jefferson and the Hemings family. During our conversation, Annette reveals how studying Thomas Jefferson allows us to get at many people and events of the American Revolution and early Republic periods, what it means to study Jefferson and other people from the past on their own terms and in their own times, and Jefferson's ideas about politics, slavery, and religion. But first, have you checked out the preview for the new Doing History to the Revolution series yet? I'm wicked excited about this series because it's going to allow us to take a deep dive into the American Revolution. I mean, we're going to explore the people, ideas, and events of the Revolution and how our understanding and views of those people's ideas and events have changed over the last 200 plus years. The full series is set to air this fall, but our series partner, the Omohundro Institute, and I will provide you with some preview episodes throughout 2017. In fact, you can check out our very first preview episode now. It's episode 112, and it's all about the tea crisis of 1773, the Boston Tea Party, and new information we have about those events. I've put a link to the episode in the show notes, or you can click the link in your Ben Franklin's World app. But you might want to wait to click that link until after you're done enjoying this conversation about Thomas Jefferson.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and a Professor of History at Harvard University. She's written 6 books, including The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction and the Pulitzer Prize in History. Today, she joins us to explore the life and ideas of Thomas Jefferson with details from her most recent book, which she co-authored with Peter Onuf, The Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of Imagination. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Annette Gordon-Reed.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
And we're so glad you could join us, Annette, because this is going to be a great conversation. Now, let's get things started with why Thomas Jefferson? I mean, this is a time where many historians eschew working on founding fathers so that they can focus on lesser-known subjects. And yet, you choose to study Jefferson and his family.
Well, I studied Jefferson and his family and slavery at Monticello. I think Jefferson is a way to get into a lot of different topics. And so studying him allows you to study a particular moment in American history because he had his hands in so many different aspects of American history that it's just a very, very full and rich topic. Certainly when I did the Hemmingses of Monticello, Jefferson is a part of that. It's a big part of it. But it's because of his life and because of his position that I was able to get into this story of an African-American enslaved family. So it's a way of doing two things at once, keeping the topic sort of big in the sense of dealing with somebody who is part of the politics of American society, but at the same time, being able to investigate the lives of lesser-known folks. So you can kind of have it all ways in dealing with him.
Now that we know why Jefferson, why did you and Peter Onuf decide to co-write another book about him? I mean, is there anything we don't know about Jefferson at this point?
We don't know a lot about Jefferson. I think certainly talking much more about slavery at Monticello, opening up the discussion about race and slavery, gives you a new way of looking at him. One of the main reasons that we thought he would make a good topic of discussion for a book is that we kind of say that Jefferson scholarship has, the phrase we use is sort of run into a ditch in focusing in on hypocrisy. And it's like the scene in Airplane, the movie Airplane, when the woman gets hysterical and then all the passengers sort of line up to, first they slap some sense into her and then everybody succeeding comes with a more fearful implement in order, to whack her. And that's kind of the way that's happened with Jefferson. It's much less about sort of discovering the person, but having people tell you through his life what they think about things. It's more about giving a chance to sort of show their disapproval rather than trying to explicate his life. So what we wanted to do was to sort of go back to first principles, and that is to say, looking at his letters. And we say in the book that we do something that we don't think has been done for a very, very long time, and that is when it's reasonable to do so, take Jefferson at his word about what his intentions are and what he's seeking to do in the world. Because we think it's not so much what we think he ought to have been doing, but what he thought he was doing in the world. And that's a way of both opening up his world and opening him up, too. So it's not about us and, okay, now here's how we're better than you are. We're better than you on race. We're better than you on slavery. We're better than you on women. We're better than you on all this other stuff. What did you think you were doing in the world? And why did you think that it was worthwhile to make the statements that you made, to chart the course that he charted? So we're trying to discover Jefferson on his own terms, which, as I said, is something we don't think has happened in a long time, if ever.
What does it mean exactly to really consider and study someone like Jefferson in their own time and on their own terms?
It means that we don't bring our sort of prejudices, we don't bring our sense of superiority to looking at his life. Doesn't mean that you excuse everything. We think history is a moral enterprise. You don't just, say, and here's how they slaughtered the innocents and then just sort of move on. We do note or we do make reference to things that might be offensive to people today that offend our sensibilities, but we really do try to see what it is that he thinks he's doing. And when he says, or when he sort of acts as a figure of enlightenment, we take him at his word with that. But we also sort of unpack the Enlightenment and see ways in which he comported with the ideals of the Enlightenment, but nevertheless, it turned out to be, sort of adhering to some of the dark side of the Enlightenment. So it means that you don't proceed with too great a judgment about people, that it's, as I said, it's not a way to show us how superior we are to him, but to understand where he was at the moment, his strengths and his weaknesses. And that means taking account of the bad things as well as the good things, and not just focusing in on the way that he, quote unquote, failed us.
You noted that we have to set aside our own views about Jefferson in order to, situate him in his own time. Do you have any advice or techniques for how we can view the past and Jefferson more objectively? Because it really does seem like there are a lot of modern books about Jefferson that do focus on some form of hypocrisy or some aspect of Jefferson's life that the author doesn't like, which I think just goes to show us that maintaining objectivity can be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you do it?
That I do it is to keep in mind that he was representative of his time. I mean, he's not some special racist monster that existed in Virginia apart from the other members of his cohort. He was a person who had the prejudices of his time and of his place and of his class and race at the time. He was different in some ways because he, at some point as a young man, began to think of himself as a person who was opposed to slavery. That was not the dominant theme in his society, and so he was sort of apart from other people. He was a person who saw himself as skeptical of religion, of organized religion, and that was a part of Enlightenment thinking. And he was a person who believed in science, that scientific rationality that you apply in science, but also could be extrapolated to regular life, would apply in the real world. That is to say, people would get better and better. There would be new discoveries. Life would be easier in certain ways, more convenient as these new discoveries were made. So he was an optimistic and hopeful person. So, if you take that as a base, that he actually did believe that, and you can see throughout his life the things that he does suggest that he believes in a notion of progress. When he said that the problem of slavery would be solved in the fullness of time, we say, ha, 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 you're just kicking the can down the road. You don't really believe that. We think he believed it, because he believed it in other areas of his life, things that we might look at and say, well, how could you possibly believe that? Because, we have seen what happened. We think that the sort of optimism that kind of bordered on denial in some ways was a real feature of his personality, not just in his politics, but in the way he went about his everyday life.
We're going to dive deep into Jefferson's ideas, but before we do that, I'd like to explore how you wrote The Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, because it's a book you co-wrote with fellow Jefferson scholar Peter Onuf. What was it like to co-write a book, and how did you divide the research and writing?
Well, the thing is, because we were using Jefferson's letters mainly, that's the bulk of the things that we're citing here. We know that material. So research was mainly trying to figure out, wasn't there some place where he said this? And then we go back and find the letter. We go outside of it for some secondary material, and it's usually stuff that we've written, but it's mainly looking at Jefferson's letters. So what we did was begin a series of formal conversations. Peter and I have known each other since 1995, and we have been engaged in an informal conversation about Jefferson since then. But here we actually formalized it by setting up a time, mainly over Skype, talking about what it is that we were trying to achieve, how to shape the book. After we got to some sort of form, we kind of said, well, do you want to start drafting the introduction? And I don't remember who wrote the first part of the introduction, but one of us wrote the first part of the introduction, and then we sent it to the other person, and we went back and forth like that. Our editor, Bob Weil, at LiveWrite, the division of Norton, wanted us to have one voice. Very often, I think when people do these collaborations, they have one person draft one chapter and then another person draft the other chapter. We didn't want to do that because, well, it would be obvious that there were two voices there and we wanted one. So we went back and forth drafting chapters. And sometimes, very often, one person would take an idea or take an area that was not our specific specialty and do it, and then have the other person look at it. So it's funny, in the New York Review of Books, Gordon Wood did a review of the book, and he generally liked it, but he said that we made no effort to disguise who wrote what. But I think he might have been assuming that topics that Peter would typically write were the ones that he wrote, and topics that I would typically write were the ones that I wrote. But that's not what happened. We mixed things up. I've listened to Peter talk for many years, but I actually went back and listened to some of his talks that are on YouTube to remind myself of how he sounded, the kinds of phrases he uses, and I tried to write like he sounded. all writers have their own tics. They have their own favorite phrases and so forth. And I can sometimes spot mine. I know mine and I know his. But for most of it, I mean, the sentences are so mixed up from my editing and his editing of me that it's hard to know who did what. So I challenge the idea that you can know precisely who wrote what, because we deliberately tried to move away from that. So it was a combination of, doing that. And then after doing this process, we do the process of Skyping and writing and editing and so forth. I think it was easy for us to do it because we basically agree about most things about Jefferson. It would have been a tougher thing if we had major disagreements, which just did not materialize. I tell the story about one point when we were working on it. We were about to deliver the manuscript, and we're on a plane coming from Helsinki to Turin. And, I think I might have been handing him pages to look, and he was sort of making comments. And it got very, very tense at that moment because it was at the very end and we're sort of turning it in. And there was no place to go when you're on a plane. You can't get up and walk out and get some fresh air or whatever. But we did that process of handing things off up until the very, very end. And, we did the best we could to create a voice.
And I think you did a great job of it because I read the book and I thought it had one voice. In fact, I was trying to figure out if you and Peter disagreed about any points about Jefferson, and I just couldn't find them. Now this sort of makes sense because now that I've heard about your process, it sounds like you and Peter talked a lot and likely worked out any of your disagreements before you finished the book.
Well, we disagreed about, I've talked a little bit about this before, Jefferson and religion. I was much more skeptical of Jefferson when he says that he is a Christian because I was adhering to the sort of traditional understanding that would come to me from the United Methodist Church of what a Christian was, and he didn't fit that mold. Peter, who grew up in the Unitarian Church, was more lenient about the tenets of Christianity, and I sort of came to agree with him at the end that I was being too rigid and prejudicial in my, statements about who's a Christian and who's not a Christian. Jefferson believed he was a Christian, but of a particular type, and as a follower of Jesus and Jesus' teachings, but not someone who believed in the miracles that Jesus was said to have performed. So I think that was a point of departure that we had, and I would say more critical of Jefferson for making this claim, but I came to see in talking to Peter that it was I who was not really being open-minded about the subject, because I do believe Unitarians think that they are a species or a type of Christian. At some point in talking to him, it occurred to me that I might have offended him by being so vociferous about, well, this isn't Christianity. That was too strident a position.
Most Blessed of the Patriarchs explores many ideas that Jefferson had about politics, society, and religion, as we've just discussed. But the book keeps coming back to the central ideas that Jefferson had about patriarchs and patriarchy. Annette, would you tell us about Jefferson's ideas about patriarchs and patriarchy? How did Jefferson come to believe that he was the most blessed of the patriarchs?
I should hasten to add that title, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, the phrase in the title is Jefferson's own description of himself. We're not calling him Most Blessed of the Patriarchs. In a letter that he writes to Angelica Schuyler Church of the Schuyler Sisters fame, now in Hamilton, in which he talks about going back to Monticello. He has resigned from being the Secretary of State after his battles with Hamilton. And he's going home to Monticello, and he's writing Angelica about it. And he says, if my daughters join me, near Monticello, I will consider myself as blessed as the most blessed of the patriarchs. And then in another letter, a couple of years later, he writes to a man and describes himself as living like an antediluvian patriarch among his children and grandchildren and on his farm at Monticello. And we thought that was sort of an interesting thing for a person who was considered to be like an avatar of the new person who was progressive and thought of the future, very future-oriented person, to think about the past in that way, to describe himself as this figure who's almost from ancient biblical times. And patriarchy now to us is a dirty word, but to him it would not have been. It sort of described what he thought was his function in life, a function that he was born to and was able to fulfill because of his talent in his own eyes as a person who was a steward of others' lives, and not just the lives of his legal white family, but of enslaved people, which is probably the most maddening thing about the whole construction of the patriarch who has his land and his family, but family in an extended sense, over whom he is supposed to exercise dominion. And he would say, benevolent dominion, and that would, again, drive us crazy. But again, thinking of what it is he's thinking. So it's his job to care for the people under his control. And that's what he thinks of himself as doing. And that is what obviously puts him so at odds with us today. So he thinks of himself as a benevolent master, not just master of enslaved people, but a benevolent husband, a benevolent ruler of his daughters. And the question is how he carries off this role, how he does this. And at some point, he moves from seeing slavery as a state of war between a master, person who's enslaving people, and those who are enslaved, to seeing it as an institution that he can ameliorate on his farm. In other words, he can become a quote-unquote good master on his plantation, and therefore enslaved people could be happy for the time until slavery is over. That's not a formulation that we think he would have used or would have thought of as a younger man. But as we talk about in the book, his experiences in France and his experiences in the American Revolutionary War helped shape his understanding of slavery. So he is a patriarch, and he sees that that's a role that is completely natural, that men should rule over women, not natural that people should rule over others as enslaved people. But while that is there, while that situation exists, he thinks he can ameliorate it, which is something that, as I said, we categorically reject. There's no good slavery. There's just, slavery. But he comes to terms with slavery by thinking of himself as a benevolent patriarch.
You noted that Jefferson thought of himself as a steward of people's lives. And we've explored a little bit about how these views worked with his nuclear and extended family. Did this idea transfer over to the people of the United States? I mean, we consider Jefferson to be a founding father, which could be seen as a patriarchal figure.
No, his conception of the people is that the people are sovereign. He's a representative of the people, but he would not construct himself as the patriarch of the people. And I don't think he would have cared very much for the designation founding father, because it's almost not like a monarchy. It's not monarchical, but I question whether he would have liked that. He wanted to be remembered, and he wanted a legacy as somebody who was a respected figure. I don't think he would have liked the sort of canonization of founding fathers and that we're supposed to be following what they do. This was a person who thought that there should be a new constitution every 19 years. The dead hand of the past was not supposed to control people today. But back to your original question about himself as a president, as a leader of people, he would not have constructed that relationship as a father or a patriarchal relationship with the people, because the people are supposed to be sovereign. And he would have said a representative of those people.
Let's explore how Jefferson developed some of his ideas. Would you tell us about Jefferson's childhood and education? Benjamin would like to know more about his education and how his studies prepared him to enter the political events that he would become immersed in.
Well, he had one of the best educations that people from his class in Virginia could have. He, studied at the English school and then went to the Latin school, a boarding school. He went to the College of William and Mary as a late teenager. He didn't go overseas. Many members of that class would have gone to England when they were young men, or perhaps done the grand tour, going through all of the capitals of Europe and seeing, the best of what Western civilization had to offer. But he was well educated here in America. He spent more years working with George Wythe, with whom he read law, than most people. He was there for almost 5 years with Wythe, whereas most people, Patrick Henry could have been as little as a few months or whatever, and then other people in all points in between. But he was what he described as a hard student. He loved books, he read a lot, and he was not self-taught, but he certainly augmented the great education that he had by his own vociferous reading. So he saw the world through books and came to view himself as part of, I don't want to say a vanguard, but a part of a group of people who were adherents to the Enlightenment and, were going to carry the Enlightenment project forward. So, he develops early on, as I mentioned, all of these sort of the stations of the cross for progressivism at the time, being anti-slavery, being anti-clerical or skeptical of organized religion. But all of this comes from books. A lot of what Jefferson is, obviously, as I said, he's not traveling as a young man and experiencing other worlds the way some of his cohort would have, but he's experiencing things through just unimaginable, just a vociferous, hungry thirst for books. his famous quote, "I cannot live without books," after he'd sold his library and then proceeded to build another. So he sees the world through books, which has its good points and its bad points. Someone said that you could sort of tell what Jefferson was reading last by some of the pronouncements that he makes in his letters. And I would say that sometimes he was too credulous in his reading. Certainly the part in Notes on the State of Virginia about orangutans and African women, the orangutans preferred African women to their own species, just as black men preferred white women to their own species. That comes out of books. I mean, he didn't just make that up. And sometimes he's too credulous in believing things. But, to answer your question, his education comes from the formal education that he got, but also just from reading, vociferous reading. And of course, he had the leisure time to do that. I mean, certainly he was busy as a government official later on and as a young man as a lawyer, but, he was a member of a class that had leisure time, to do things like that and to educate himself even further than his formal education would have prepared him for.
Many listeners had questions about Jefferson's politics and his views on slavery. But before we address these specific questions, would you tell us about Jefferson's political beliefs in 1776? Why did he embrace and work to support the American Revolution?
Well, again, it's part of his rejection of the old world. Monarchy, these are things that he thinks it's a backward system of government. And he thought that something new could be created here on the American continent. So monarchs are in line with the church. The church and the state were usually aligned, and the state as a monarchy, with an aspect of monarchy in it, he thought was inimical to the kind of development of a free people, of free thought, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, and so forth. So he thinks that we could do something different. He is appalled by war, and a lot of what the monarchies and families of the great nations of Europe did was war with one another. And so you had the state being enlisted in these types of wars, and Jefferson abhorred that. One of the reasons that he wanted the United States to be separate and on its own, and why he thought it was really important to have the country extend from one ocean to the next and north and the south to take as much territory as he could, was to take the United States out of European balance of power politics and thus war. That's why you had to have the whole continent. And he is looking for a different way of constituting society than societies based upon monarchies and parliaments, so forth, that help out with monarchy, and the church that helps out as well. So, initially, he loved Great Britain. He loved what would have been thought of as the British Constitution, which is not one singular document, but all of the documents that gave rise to liberty. He was a fan of the British Empire, but he gradually became disenchanted with it and thought that we could do better, that a United States could do better than what had been done before, and build a society that's based upon, and this is very idealistic, but free trade, comity with other nations, but not conquest and not conflict through wars. And of course, the westward hoe business meant that there would be conflicts because obviously there are Native Americans there. It wasn't empty land, but his vision was that if their blood would mix with whites, they would become one people. But if they didn't, the settlers would basically overtake them. And so that's another problem that we have with Jefferson and his attitude about Native Americans, that they either had to assimilate or that they would be destroyed. But those were his politics, that we're going to create an empire for liberty here on the North American continent.
Monique would like to know how Jefferson intended to create an empire of liberty. She notes that he penned the words "all men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence, and yet also supported slavery. Would you help us better understand Jefferson's seemingly paradoxical views on slavery and freedom?
It's no more than that he had a set of intellectual beliefs, because Peter and I really do believe that he thought that slavery was a radical injustice that he wasn't able to live up to in his own life. He thought that the solution should be a society-wide solution. Freeing slaves on an individual basis, while, we think it's a good thing, and it was a way of sort of skirting the issue. It made the handful of people who did that feel good about themselves, but they were not dealing with the real issue, and that there had to be emancipation. And he believed expatriation, because blacks and whites could not live together without conflict, that there would in fact be the equivalent of a race war if blacks were emancipated and if they remained in the United States. So I think on the question of emancipation and slavery, this was just not a question that he was willing to deal with in his own personal life. slavery, as I talked about in Hemings' Monticello a bit more, is that slavery brought many positive goods to Jefferson, not just in terms of money, because it really didn't do that much. Monticello was not a profitable farm, or, his other places made some money, but not enough to make him really rich or to avoid dying $107,000 in debt in 1826. But he could not see his way to free his own slaves because it brought, he enjoyed Monticello. Most of the people that he has working there are working on the house or working in the house. They're not in the fields producing productive crops. He thought that this was something that the next generation would handle. His position was, look, we helped create a country. We've put the conditions in place for a Republican solution to this, namely people decide after presumably they become more enlightened that slavery was in fact deleterious to the nation and that people would come to that conclusion. Now, of course, that makes us crazy because we know what happened. And we know that this notion of becoming enlightened and gradually coming to some sort of consensus without warfare could have gone on indefinitely. But as I said before, in the beginning, he actually did believe that there would be progress. I'm trying to think of something today where we say, well, this is really bad, but one of these days we'll have a better way of doing this, or people won't do this. That was his vision. And I don't think that he was punting on that. It's just that we are obsessed with race and slavery, and I think, rightly so, but he was not. Jefferson's most important thing was his participation in the American Revolution. He was interested in the development of the United States. And having created a country, been a governor, co-authored the Declaration of Independence, done lots of different things, I think he said, well, what are you going to do? What is the next generation of people going to do? And I don't think he thought it was for him to be responsible for that. Now, we make him responsible for the Declaration, but that seems a little unfair. You've done this, you've done that, you've done this, you've created a country, you've done all these other things. Why didn't you solve slavery? And you compare that to us as individuals or other politicians or people who exist today, how much should any one person do and be responsible for? And it's funny because we don't hold Madison to that as well. Madison owned slaves and claimed to be anti-slavery. Washington freed his slaves, but he freed his slaves upon his death, and he freed his slaves knowing that his heirs, the stepchildren, were going to be getting slaves from their family, from the Custis family. The people who didn't get his slaves got slaves from other people. So it's a different situation. You wonder what Washington would have done if he'd had children, if there had been a George Washington Jr., or if he knew that the Custis stepchildren or step-grandchildren would not have gotten anything from anybody else. So they're not similarly situated. There's nobody who's had more political capital than Washington, and he expended none of it on this question. So, I hate to get into the battle of the network of founding fathers, but it's an interesting thing that we really hold Jefferson to this standard when the other people around him either have a better shot, because there were people who always hated Jefferson. Jefferson did not have the political capital that Washington had and would not have influenced as many people as Washington could have if he had spoken when he was president. But we're glad that he freed his slaves, but they were thinking about something else. They thought that this problem would resolve itself, and we can fault them for that, but our preoccupations and our concerns were not theirs. And there were very, very few people who were sacrificing their careers, sacrificing their chance to have a legacy in order to end slavery during Jefferson's time. Garrison is the first person. Garrison is the hero. More people should know William Lloyd Garrison than actually know him, because it was an extraordinary thing to be both anti-slavery and, as much as he could, anti-racist. But Jefferson gets held up, I think, largely because of the Declaration and the sort of paradox. And so we fixate on him when, as I said, John Marshall, James Madison, James Monroe, George Washington, all these people lived this life. And there's no reason to think that their views about race and slavery were greatly different from Jefferson's.
That's a really interesting point, that we today are the ones who are obsessed with questions about race and slavery. And your description about Jefferson's views on slavery really allows us to see what we were talking about objectivity towards the start of our conversation, about how you and Peter are trying to view and understand Jefferson in his own time, and how many of us, when we think about Jefferson today, we really do view his views on slavery using our own 21st century viewpoints.
I wish I could find another word than obsession, because that's almost pejorative. But I'm saying we have an enlightenment that he sort of thought we would have, actually. We have an enlightenment about this matter that he perceived but wasn't as real to him as it is to us. We've had the advantage of many, many things that have happened between 1826 and 2016. We've had the chance to learn a lot during that time period. And this is not to say that you don't pay attention to this stuff, that you don't point this out, but it really is sort of over the top in dealing with him to say, why didn't you do this? And it's like, well, how much? I mean, seriously, to me, one of the things that I felt writing this book or working on this book with Peter is to think about how hard it is to do anything in the world, to make a change in the world, to make a difference in the world. And here is a person who did lots of things. And then to say, you should have solved this problem too. If I look at my own life and compare, well, I haven't done nearly as much as that. And a lot of the people who are being supremely critical haven't done nearly as much. It's hard to accomplish things in a lifetime. And, it doesn't mean that you aren't critical of him and you're critical of the racism and so forth, but those were the feelings of the time and those are the feelings of many people today. But it's out of proportion, I think, to, what we should be doing, considering that he was definitely within the normal range of people at that time. And as I said, people today in terms of their racial attitude. So, to me, it's much more, I wonder why people today harbor these feelings. People who ought to know better, people who've had the example of many things, the Holocaust, the terrible price you pay when you begin to think in racial terms about people. We've had all of this stuff. And yet there are still people today who believe these things. So that concerns me more than somebody who was born in 1743, that he doesn't have a well-developed sense of why racism is bad. Just doesn't strike me as terribly interesting.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk more deeply about something we already previewed early in our conversation. Chris would like to know more about Jefferson's views on religion. Would you tell us about Jefferson's religious beliefs and about the Jefferson Bible?
Well, Jefferson early on developed a skepticism of organized religion because, as I said, he related it to monarchy and all kinds of things, ideas and people who would seek to control people through ideas, and through religion. He said some really pretty rough things about clerics. But one of the things that we found, one of the things we talk about in the book, is that as he got older, I think it was probably under the influence of what happened in the election of 1800, in which people in New England, the Federalists, really gave him a hard time about their belief that he was an atheist. People suggested that he was going to, take their Bibles, and people were burying Bibles and so forth. But he was an atheist. And so he started working on the Jefferson Bible, or what he calls the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, while he's president. He puts it away and returns to it later on when he's in retirement. But he thinks that this will prove that he is, in fact, a real Christian, that he was, in fact, a Christian. What he believed was that Jesus was the greatest moral philosopher who'd ever lived, and that people should follow Jesus' teachings, but they should not adhere to the notion of the miracles that he thought had been grafted onto Jesus' story. That Jefferson thought that Jesus never made some of the claims that were made for him in the Gospels. These things had been added on. So he considered himself to be, and he used the phrase, primitive Christian. He believed in Jesus' teachings, but not all this other stuff. But at the same time, he really sort of goes on a religious quest when he's in retirement, in the sense that he's reading the Bible quite a bit. And he tells people about this, and people observe, his overseer mentions that when he goes to Jefferson's room, the Bible is there open. And Jefferson is talking about reading the Bible quite a bit. So he's trying to find a way to create a type of religion that would be fit for a Republican society. That's what we think, and he thought that the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth could be that, because he understood that religion was always going to be important in America. I mean, he couldn't have conceived of a time, I think, that people didn't adhere to some form of religion, because it was so pervasive during that time period, and it was so important during that time period. So he wanted to create a book that could be used by people in a secular society, in a Republican society, that you would get the good teachings of Jesus, but you wouldn't be divided on the basis of miracles, whether you believe these miracles or not. So his religious beliefs, he thought that everybody one day would be a Unitarian. He predicted that all thinking people one day would become Unitarian, and the Unitarians don't believe in the Trinity and take a different view about the miracles of the Bible. So that's what the Life and Morals is about. It is a, quote, religious text for what he would think would be the fully Republican cosmopolitan society. Good teachings from Jesus without mystification, without the intercession of priests and people who would try to control individuals.
Before we move into the time warp, the students in Mrs. Monahan's history class at the Cheshire Academy in Connecticut want to know what you think about Lin-Manuel Miranda's writing and Daveed Diggs's portrayal of Jefferson in the Broadway play Hamilton, an American Musical.
I love the musical. I've only seen it once, but I have the cast album that I've listened to quite a bit. I was on this documentary about it that aired last week, answering questions about Jefferson. I didn't get a chance to see all of it, so I don't know exactly what I said, but I think I would have said that I really enjoy the musical. It's not really the story of Alexander Hamilton. Really, it is a great creation of a version of Hamilton. I like Daveed Diggs' portrayal of Jefferson. It's sort of mischievous. He sort of turns Jefferson inside out in the sense that Jefferson was a very reserved person for the most part. I mean, he would not have been that, jazzy, to put it. But I think the performance is brilliant because it shows the kind of, the word I used was mischievous nature of politics, of Jefferson the politician. He's sort of pulling the strings behind the scenes. In the play, he's much more upfront, but as I said, turning him inside out. These are all the things that are happening that Jefferson would have been thinking, and Jefferson was sort of putting into play. The real Jefferson during the 1790s, supporting newspapers that are, writing against the government that he is a part of, supporting James Callender, who's writing negative things about John Adams and so forth. And it's just a lot of fun. I think he was the best thing in the play. The energy level that's already very, very high goes up even more when he came on stage. I haven't seen the play since he's left it, but I thought he was wonderful. It's hard to see how he could be replaced.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Thomas Jefferson had taken action to abolish slavery in the United States? What actions do you think he would have taken to abolish slavery? And how would these actions have affected his political career, our memory of him, and the course of United States history?
Wow. Well, I think if Jefferson had taken concerted action to end slavery in the United States, he would have destroyed his career in Virginia, and we would not be having a podcast about him. I think it became clear to him as a member of the Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses, when he and a cousin wanted to introduce a measure for emancipation in Virginia, and it was sort of resoundingly rejected. In 1796, he knew of St. George Tucker's emancipation plan that the legislature would not even accept when he wanted to send it to them. He understood his countrymen, and he would have used that term countrymen to describe fellow Virginians. He knew that they were not going to vote slavery out of existence or get rid of slavery. And so he turned himself to the things that he could, in fact, work on, and that is promoting the United States, promoting the Republican Party. What he could have done, I suppose, would have been to start in Virginia to do it, but I don't think he would have gotten very far. And I think he would have made himself a pariah. He would have destroyed his political usefulness, and he would not have been president to buy Louisiana. I mean, he probably wouldn't have had to buy Louisiana, but we don't know what would have happened with that. I just think he would have been finished if he actually became a serious abolitionist, the way people suggest he should have been. He was not in the right place. I mean, if he had been in New England, perhaps, but even still, I think a person who was a committed abolitionist who actually devoted their lives and energy to trying to change it at the time that he was living and active as a politician in the 1790s and the 18 teens would have destroyed themselves. So we would not be talking about him today. He would have gone back to Monticello. He would have still had Monticello, and unless he freed his slaves then. If he freed his slaves, again, he would still be in obscurity, and he would not be a figure. We would remember that he drafted the Declaration of Independence and was ambassador to France at some point, but I think his career would have been over.
Now that you've grappled with Jefferson, what aspect of history are you researching now?
Well, I'm supposed to be doing, and am doing, a second volume of the Hemmings story. So I'm taking the Hemmingses into the 19th century. I am supposed to be doing, after that, a 2-volume biography of Jefferson, a real soup-to-nuts biography of Jefferson. I'm having a little second thoughts about that. Texas, my home state of Texas, is something that I think I want to write about. So maybe tackling slavery in Texas, or just writing about the phenomenon of Texas that's sort of bubbling up. And I'm talking to my editor about that, about the possibility of switching, but we'll see. Well, it'll definitely be the Hemmingses, and it'll either be Jefferson or Texas after that.
Where should we look for more information about you and how we can contact you if we still have questions about Thomas Jefferson?
You Google my name, and my information here at Harvard Law School is all up on the web. And also, I guess if you Google the Harvard History Department, things would come up as well. So it has a bio there, and it has my email, and I hear from people all the time.
And you're active on Twitter too, right?
Yeah, Twitter and Facebook. Facebook is more limited, but, I am on Twitter. I have a book, and we talk about the book, and we talk about appearances and other kinds of things. Yeah, so that's a way as well to be in touch. I like it.
Annette Gordon-Reed, thank you so much for taking us inside the world of Thomas Jefferson and for helping us kind of get inside his head so that we can better understand him.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for asking me.
Do we ask too much from those who founded the United States? Jefferson co-authored the Declaration of Independence and served as governor of Virginia, minister to France, secretary of state, president, and he founded the University of Virginia. Therefore, is it really too much for us to ask that he also share our 21st century viewpoints on race, slavery, and the idea that all men and women are created equal? This is a most intriguing thought and question, and that reminds us that we have to view Jefferson and all other people from the past within the context of their own time and place. That doesn't mean we have to ignore the fact that Jefferson believed in and espoused ideas of freedom and yet owned slaves. It just means we have to acknowledge the fact that he was a slaveholder, like many men of his time and class, and study and compare his views on slavery to those of the people around him. We also need to resist the urge to impose our present-day views and ideas on people from the past. Because if we view historic people, like Jefferson, with ideas that were common to us, but were not common to them, it makes people from the past hard to understand and relate to. As Annette suggested throughout our conversation, we need to view the past objectively, because it's only when we view people within their own time and place that we can truly understand who they were, their actions, and their contributions to how we came to be who we are today. Check out the show notes page for more information about Annette, her book, The Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, and everything we talked about today. benfranklinsworld.com/117. This episode was brought to you by Cornell University Press. Cornell publishes some of the most interesting books about early American history. Books like Margaret Newell's award-winning book, Brethren by Nature, New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell for more details about Cornell University Press and their list of great titles. And don't forget to use the special promo code if you like what you see, because it will give you a 30% discount. Finally, do you think Jefferson would have freed his slaves if he had been on the same economic footing as George Washington? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.